Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, June 7th, 2022. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer saying the bipartisan group of senators negotiating a response to the recent mass shootings are making enough progress and they will be given more time to try to reach a deal. Actor and activist Matthew McConaughey, who grew up in Uvalde, Texas, site of one of those mass shootings recently, taking part in the White House briefing today with reporters, urging senators to reach a compromise on what he calls gun responsibility rather than gun control. Son of a victim of the racially motivated mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, telling senators on the Judiciary Committee, "Is there nothing that you personally are willing to do to stop the cancer of white supremacy and the domestic terrorism it inspires? If there is nothing, then, respectfully, senators, you should yield your positions of authority and influence to others that are willing to lead on this issue." U.S. House getting set to vote on its own gun violence prevention measures, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi today visiting a gun violence memorial on the National Mall in Washington. It has over 45,000 flowers, one each for the number of Americans killed by guns every year. Republicans and allies of former President Donald Trump plan counterprogramming to Thursday's hearing of the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. We'll get the latest on this from a reporter with Axios. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen telling a Senate committee that current levels of inflation are unacceptable. Republicans asking her about the role that government spending has played. And the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson holding a cabinet meeting the day after surviving a no-confidence vote from his own party, promising to continue working on his domestic economic agenda. We start with TheHill.com, a story there. Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer, a Democrat from New York, saying Tuesday he is encouraging a bipartisan group of negotiators to keep working on a compromise proposal to respond to recent mass shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas. The Senate Democratic leader said last month that he would give Senate Republicans only a short amount of time to agree to compromise legislation, and warned if they do not strike a deal, he will force a vote on democratically crafted gun control legislation. The article goes on Tuesday, Schumer indicated he thinks the talks are making enough progress to give them more time.
Before Memorial Day, I make clear that the Senate will vote on gun safety legislation in the near future. To that end, a handful of my Democratic colleagues, led by Senator Murphy and including the great work of Senators Blumenthal, Sinema, Manchin, Coons, Heinrich, and others, have been holding extended and substantive talks with Republicans to see what can pass this chamber that will meaningfully address our nation's gun violence epidemic. I'm encouraging my Democratic colleagues to keep talking, to see if Republicans will work with us to come up with something that will make a meaningful change in the lives of the American people and help stop gun violence. There's virtual unanimity among Senate Democrats that getting something passed through this chamber is worth pursuing if it will make a tangible difference in preventing gun violence. We know we're not going to get everything we want. We know that the push for even more meaningful gun safety will continue after this debate, but making real progress is very important. Senator Murphy has asked for some space to have the bipartisan talks continue, and I have given him that space. I look forward to discussing the status of those talks with my colleagues today. We owe it to American parents. We owe it to American kids. We owe it to every single neighborhood, every single community, every single household that has been ripped apart by gun violence. This is a tough fight. Nevertheless, we have a moral obligation to do everything conceivable to break the cycle of violence. In the wake of the tragedies in Uvalde and Buffalo, we have a chance to tell the American people that this time their anguish will not fall on deaf ears. We have a chance to tell them we hear them, that we too are angry, and we are going to do everything we can to make some real progress in the Senate, difficult as that is. But it's only going to happen if both sides keep working. Only with that will hope for a compromise translate into real, concrete legislation. We know it's a difficult hurdle to overcome, but nevertheless, we must do everything we can to try and succeed.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor today. The lead negotiator on the Republican side, Senator John Cornyn of Texas, had also asked for additional time to continue the talks with the Republicans and the Democrats, that small group. Senator Cornyn saying on the Senate floor on Monday, I hope the Democratic leader will allow bipartisan discussions to continue and then conclude before he pulls the plug and schedules show votes on something he knows he can't pass. How long will this go on? Senator Schumer later telling reporters that Senator Chris Murphy tells him a deal is possible by the end of this week. And if there is no agreement by then, Senator Schumer said the situation will be reevaluated. Senator Cornyn giving other Senate Republicans an update on the talks during the regular Republican private Tuesday lunch. And after that, the Senate Republican leaders usually come out and speak with reporters. Mitch McConnell leading off the news conference.
With regard to the ongoing issue about violence, Senator Cornyn, as you know, is representing our side in discussions with Senator Murphy. We're hoping to actually get an outcome that'll make a difference in the areas of mental health, school safety, and things that are related to the incidents that occurred in Texas and in Buffalo.
The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, part of his opening statement at this news conference. Then other members of the Senate Republican leadership gave some remarks. Senator McConnell coming back for questions. The first one was on guns.
Leader McConnell.
Chad.
Are you concerned that if they get an agreement on firearms here, that we're going to have a majority of your caucus that's going to oppose this? That's going to be the Democrats plus a small percentage of Republicans who carry the freight on that. And what does that say about the Republican Party if it is just a small portion of your caucus that's willing to meet?
Well, step one, obviously, is to try to get a bipartisan agreement. Senator Cornyn knows more about this subject than anybody we have in the Senate. He also happens to represent Texas, and I think is working in good faith with Senator Murphy to try to get an outcome. I think it's way too soon to start predicting how many are going to vote for it. We don't have an agreement yet, and so I don't want to speculate about how many of my members might support it. Step one is to try to get a deal. As I've said repeatedly, I hope that'll be sooner rather than later. Everybody would like to, almost everybody I think would like to get an outcome that's definitely related to the subject matter.
Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky with reporters on Capitol Hill. From CNN, President Joe Biden on Tuesday met with Senator Chris Murphy, one of the top Democratic lawmakers negotiating on gun reform, at the White House for an update as talks intensify on Capitol Hill. Senator Murphy telling CNN as he entered the West Wing, we're entering a pretty critical stage, so I thought it would be important to just come over and fill him in on where our discussions are. Article at CNN continues, asked who scheduled Tuesday's meeting, the Connecticut Democrat said we thought it was mutually beneficial to have a conversation. Well, later, after the private Democratic senators' luncheon, the leaders came out and spoke with reporters. Senator Murphy was there with an update.
All of us were home in our states last week, and I think we all had a common experience. In Connecticut, the level of anxiety and fear and unrest from parents and kids that I talk to has no precedent. Parents and kids are really worried about their safety. And they're equally worried that the adults who run the country aren't serious about protecting our communities and our schools. This, to me, feels like a moment where doing nothing is simply not an option. Now, we have to pass legislation that saves lives. None of us should be interested in just checking a box. But I'm encouraged by the discussions that we have had with Republicans over the course of the last week and a half. Every day we get closer to an agreement, not further away. I'm grateful to all of the members of our caucus who have pitched into these discussions, and I'm grateful to Senator Schumer for giving us the space that we need to land an agreement. Obviously, an agreement that we reach with the Republicans won't come close to the full list of things I think are necessary to curb this epidemic. But the American people are looking for progress right now. They're looking for action. And my hope is in the coming days, we'll be able to come together in a way that gets us 60 plus votes. Remember, there's no other country in the world in which our kids fear for their lives when they go to school.
Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, with reporters on Capitol Hill. He also appeared on ABC TV's The View, and he confirmed, there was a question asked about this, that a ban on assault weapons is not part of the negotiations. He said there simply would not be enough Republican votes to overcome the guaranteed filibuster, 60 votes needed to break any filibuster. But Senator Murphy telling The View we can find an agreement that saves lives around making sure that only law-abiding citizens get access to really powerful firearms. As for what is on the table, this from Politico, Senators Murphy, Cornyn, Sinema, and Tillis are focused on a package that would reform background checks, encourage state red flag laws, enhance school safety, and provide new mental health programs, according to multiple people familiar with the talks. Actor Matthew McConaughey's hometown is Uvalde, Texas, the site of the recent mass shooting in which one young gunman killed 19 elementary school students and 2 teachers. McConaughey writing in an op-ed that gun responsibility rather than gun control is needed. He said the first is a mandate that can infringe on our right. The second is a duty that will preserve it. There is no constitutional barrier to gun responsibility. Matthew McConaughey was in Washington today, joining White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her daily briefing. McConaughey urging the bipartisan group of senators to reach a compromise. He favors background checks, red flag laws, and raising the minimum age for buying an assault rifle to 21.
Look, we heard from so many people, right? Families of the deceased, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, Texas Rangers, hunters, Border Patrol, and responsible gun owners who won't give up their Second Amendment right to bear arms. And you know what they all said? We want secure and safe schools, and we want gun laws that won't make it so easy for the bad guys to get these damn guns. So, we know it's on the table. We need to invest in mental health care. We need safer schools. We need to restrain sensationalized media coverage. We need to restore our family values. We need to restore our American values. And we need responsible gun ownership. Responsible gun ownership. We need background checks. We need to raise the minimum age to purchase an AR-15 rifle to 21. We need a waiting period for those rifles. We need red flag laws and consequences for those who abuse them. These are reasonable, practical, tactical regulations to our nation, states, communities, schools, and homes. Responsible gun owners are fed up with the Second Amendment being abused and hijacked by some deranged individuals. These regulations are not a step back. They're a step forward for a civil society and the Second Amendment. Now look, is this cure-all? Hell no. But people are hurting. Families are, parents are. And look, as divided as our country is, this gun responsibility issue is one that we agree on more than we don't. It really is.
Actor and activist Matthew McConaughey in the White House briefing room. He was born in Uvalde, Texas, site of that recent mass shooting at the elementary school. While Senate bipartisan talks continue about gun legislation, the U.S. House plans to move ahead with its own package this week. It was reported out of the House Judiciary Committee last week on a party line vote, Democrats supporting, Republicans opposing. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, taking part today in a memorial to the victims of gun violence. It was near the Washington Monument on the National Mall. Over 45,000 red and white flowers representing those who die in 1 year in the United States. Speaker Pelosi beginning with what is in the bill that will come up on the House floor.
Raise the age to buy weapons of war, restrict access to ghost guns, outlaw high-capacity magazines, ban civilian bump stock sales, crack down on gun trafficking, and advance safe gun storage. My colleagues here will speak to that. Many of them are the authors of this legislation. I want to just talk about Haley, my constituent. We had such an event in not this large, in San Francisco the other day. Haley came and talked to us. She lost both of her parents to gun violence. Both of her parents to gun violence. She's in 5th grade. She's in 5th grade, and she is an agent for change. She is being raised by her grandmother. She and her brother are raised by their grandmother. Thank God for the grandmother. But here she is, a little girl, speaking out against gun violence from personal experience, but with great wisdom. We owe the children of our country so much more than excuses for why we don't have legislation. To our representatives of the teachers, Becky Pringle and Randy Weingarten, who are here, we also want to salute our teachers for their courage in all of this. But it is a message that I send to elected officials all the time. You can't vote for these bills because it's a problem for you politically. Understand this. Your political survival is nothing compared to the survival of our children. We must protect them.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi on the National Mall in Washington near the Washington Monument, part of a gun violence memorial commissioned by the gun violence prevention organization Giffords, founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, Democrat from Arizona, who survived a serious gunshot wound to the head in 2011 while speaking to constituents in Tucson. 6 people died in that mass shooting. Gabby Giffords also at today's news conference saying now is the time to come together, be responsible. CBS News has this. The former commissioner of the Buffalo Fire Department, whose 86-year-old mother was fatally shot at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York last month, pressured senators to address the rising threat of domestic terrorism, asking if there's nothing you personally are willing to do to stop the spread of extremist ideology at the root of numerous violent attacks in recent years. CBS article goes on. Garnell Whitfield Jr. testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee at a hearing on the growing domestic terrorism threat following the massacre in Buffalo, noting assessments by federal law enforcement that white supremacy is the greatest domestic threat. Whitfield lamented that nothing has been done to mitigate it or eradicate it.
Our lives are forever changed, forever damaged by an act of profound hate and evil, and nothing will ever take away the hurt, the pain, or the hole in our hearts. For her to be murdered, taken away from us by someone so full of hate, is impossible to understand and even harder to live with. But we're more than hurt. We're angry. We're mad as hell because this should have never happened. We're good citizens, good people. We believe in God. We trust in God. But this wasn't an act of God. This was an act of a person. And he did not act alone. He was radicalized by white supremacists. His anger and hatred were metastasized like a cancer by people with big microphones in high places screaming that black people were going to take away their jobs and opportunities. Every enforcement agency charged with protecting the homeland has conducted risk and threat analysis and determined that white supremacy is the #1 threat to the homeland. And yet, nothing has been done to mitigate it or eradicate it. We're people of decency. We're taught to love even our enemies. But our enemies don't love us. So what are we supposed to do with all our anger and all of our pain? Do you expect us to continue to just forgive and forget over and over again? And what are you doing? You're elected to protect us, to protect our way of life. I ask every one of you to imagine the faces of your mothers as you look at mine, and ask yourself, is there nothing that we can do? Is there nothing that you personally are willing to do to stop the cancer of white supremacy and the domestic terrorism it inspires? Because if there is nothing, then, respectfully, senators, you should yield your positions of authority and influence to others that are willing to lead on this issue. The urgency of the moment demands no less. My mother's life mattered. My mother's life mattered. And your actions here today will tell us how much it matters to you.
Garnell Whitfield Jr. testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. His mother, Ruth Whitfield, one of the 10 people shot and killed in the attack at the Tops Friendly Market in Buffalo, New York last month. The accused gunman, a self-described white supremacist who authorities say posted detailed plans and racist motivation online before the attack. More from the CBS News article about today's hearing. It is unclear whether Republicans and Democrats can coalesce around a legislative plan to bolster efforts targeting domestic terrorism. The Senate last week failed to advance a bill requiring the FBI, Justice Department, and Department of Homeland Security to open offices dedicated to tackling domestic terrorism and create a task force to address white supremacy in the U.S. military. The bill passed the Democratic-led House days after the Buffalo shooting. Now back to the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. Here is Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, raising concerns with another witness, Justin Herdman, former U.S. Attorney, Northern District of Ohio.
Anytime there is an act of domestic terrorism, it should be prosecuted. Domestic terrorism is bad, regardless of what ideology happens to flow from it. And one of the concerns that I've heard expressed about the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, concerns that have been attributed to Department of Justice career attorneys in reviewing the legislation, is they worry that this could artificially constrain the department's resources, directing them toward one particular ideology over another. With domestic terrorism, as in so many other areas of criminal law, there is a high likelihood that what's big one year might change the next year. What's happening a lot in one season of one year might change in the next season of that same year. So my concern would be if we start adopting legislation that directs our activities, devotes more resources to one particular ideology over another, that might leave prosecutors flat-footed when the circumstances change, and that could create other problems. Now, Mr. Herdman, what would be the practical result, in your view, of various executive office reorganizations that would be required within the Department of Justice under the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act?
Well, I think, one concern that I would have is from the perspective of, say, a rabbi in suburban Cleveland. Whether the threat to my synagogue is from a white supremacist, or it's from a violent jihadist, or it's from some other group, that doesn't matter to me as much as the fact that there is a threat that's existent, and federal law enforcement has to be able to respond to the threat to that particular target. So I would worry a little bit about escalating or elevating a particular threat profile, because you may unintentionally lose sight of other threats. I think it's better to have a flexible federal law enforcement response, Senator.
Justin Herdman is former U.S. Attorney, Northern District of Ohio, getting questions from Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, at today's Judiciary Committee hearing on domestic terrorism and white supremacy. You can find the full hearing archived at our website, cspan.org. Associated Press writing that a looming Supreme Court decision on abortion and increase of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border and the midterm elections are potential triggers for extremist violence over the next 6 months, the Department of Homeland Security said Tuesday. The U.S. was in a heightened threat environment already, and these factors may worsen the situation, DHS said in the latest National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin. We're learning more about the hearing coming up, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol Committee hearing Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern. NBC News saying that a Capitol police officer who was one of the first injured while trying to hold back a pro-Trump mob looking to storm the U.S. Capitol, Carolyn Edwards, will be testifying, according to sources familiar with the matter. C-SPAN Radio and TV will be carrying the hearing live, as will most of the commercial TV, broadcast, and cable news channels, but not Fox News, it's been announced. Congressman Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, asked about that today, interviewed on CNN.
Historians have wondered, and sometimes on this broadcast, what Watergate would have resulted in the age of partisan right-wing media. If there was a storyline that came through to a significant part of the population, different from the facts as we knew them, we're going to get a test now with these January 6 hearings, at least on the first one. We know that Fox will not be airing them. I wonder, what is the significance of that in your view, and how can the committee, how can Democrats get through to a significant portion of the country with the results of this investigation?
It's going to be difficult. I know CNN the new leadership is looking going more toward the middle and getting a broader viewership. But Fox has the predominance of Trump supporters and Republicans, and it's harder to get the news through Fox than it is to get it in Russia through the Russian television. They will not run the hearings. They will probably not report much on them, and if they do, they'll mostly have Jim Jordan and Elise Stefanik saying things that Democrats are communists and pedophiles and you name it. So it's hard to get across to them, but there's a middle ground. There's what we always call the suburban housewife, independents who will listen and who will recoil at what they learn about the president's direct involvement and direction. The fact that on the day of the insurrection, instead of acting to protect the Capitol and the legislature, he was enjoying it. He was watching it on television and he was cheering for his team to win. And that was for America to lose. So I think the hearings are going to be very important. Comparing it to Watergate, this is Watergate with capital letters and exclamation points. Nixon was wrong. He was a crook. He sent some of his people to break into the Democratic headquarters. He didn't send his people to break into the Capitol and take over the government and intimidate, threaten, and possibly kill Congress people and senators. There are no Howard Bakers around today who would go to the president and say, you must resign.
Congressman Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, on CNN. An article by Andrew Solender, congressional reporter with Axios, begins, former President Trump and his allies, in conjunction with top House Republican leadership and conservative groups, have begun pulling documents and coordinating a behind-the-scenes effort to counter-program the January 6th committee's televised hearings this month, Axios has learned. Andrew Solender joining us now by phone. Thanks for being here.
No problem.
What kind of counter-programming are we talking about?
So first, I just want to point out my colleague Elena Treen played a huge role in reporting this as well. What we've basically learned is that the argument against the committee from Republicans is twofold. Firstly, that the committee lacks legitimacy because of its makeup. Speaker Pelosi refused to seat two of Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's appointees last year, prompting McCarthy to pull all five of his appointees. So the committee is made up of 7 Democrats and 2 Republicans, all of whom were appointed by Pelosi. And so the argument goes that because the committee doesn't have the partisan makeup or the number of members that it was meant to have in the resolution, that it lacks legitimacy, it lacks subpoena power. This is an argument Republicans have been laying out for a while in legal briefs and cases against their subpoenas, trying to knock them down. The other argument is that focuses on January 6th fatigue, basically the conceit that voters have moved on in a way that Washington hasn't, and that issues that hit voters in their wallets, like gas prices, inflation, are far more important, politically speaking, and to their constituents than January 6th is. Basically casting January 6th as a beltway-focused issue that doesn't have any real bearing on the lives of constituents. And finally, the Republicans are also trying to be as reactive as possible. They don't know exactly what's going to come up in these hearings. They don't know all the testimony that the committee has yet to release, or, possible text messages, as we've seen from text messages given to the committee by former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. A lot of Republicans texted him either with enthusiasm. A lot of Republican members of Congress texted him with either enthusiasm about efforts to overturn the election or urging President Trump to make a statement as violence was unfolding at the Capitol. So information that has a direct bearing on members of the Republican caucus and can put them in an awkward public position. So Republicans are going to tailor their message, at least in part, on what actually gets revealed during the hearing.
And do we know how they plan to get this message out? What outlets they are going to use?
So, I mean, conservative channels like Fox News, Newsmax, OAN are all, of course, very prominent platforms. Steve Bannon's podcast is a huge repository for sort of Republican narratives. Social media, Trump, who's really coordinating this effort, by the way, and has been actively recruiting allies in Congress and elsewhere to spread his rebuttal. His political movement is built on communicating with people directly through social media, both on traditional platforms like Twitter and Facebook, as well as, his own platform, Truth Social. So those are all places where we'll see this play out. I mean, we've seen this as well we've seen it in the courts. Kevin McCarthy filed an amicus brief with Steve Scalise's number 2, arguing against a contempt of Congress charge against Steve Bannon for refusing to comply with the committee's subpoena. That brief making, again, the case that the committee is illegitimate and lacks true subpoena power. And we've seen it in op-eds as well. Jim Jordan and I believe Jim Banks or McCarthy authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, really going hard at the committee. So it's really a multi-pronged media strategy here, but mainly focused on conservative outlets, places where they can really have a friendly reception.
We're talking with Andrew Solender with Axios. Any rumblings that former President Trump himself might make an appearance somewhere?
We're not quite sure about that. As you recall, Trump, ended up not doing his rebuttal to the January 6th anniversary. It seems like if that does happen, it will happen quite impromptu. I've heard from sources that the January 6th anniversary, the messaging they did has been looked full. And so if they were to replicate that, then no, Trump wouldn't be the one to actually deliver that rebuttal. It would be done for him through his allies. But it remains to be seen whether he'll play a more personal role this time around. And it may also, again, depend on what we actually hear in the hearings. According to CNN, Mike Pence's aides and their testimony may play heavily into that. That obviously hits very close to home for Trump and would put viewers of the hearings in the White House and in the West Wing at the time that the violence at the Capitol is unfolding. So really in Trump's backyard, and giving us sort of a play-by-play of what was happening in the room at the time. And so, he may feel compelled then to give his own version of events if that's what the committee reveals. But I think a lot of this will depend on just how explosive what we hear from these hearings is.
And a final question, a line from your story at Axios.com, that Republicans are faced with a difficult balancing act. Don't give the hearings free publicity, but also establish a coordinated defense strategy to push back against the coming bombshells. How difficult will that balancing act be?
Republicans have so far sort of made that their philosophy, where they don't tend to acknowledge the existence of the committee unless it becomes the A1 story of the day. So obviously in instances like where the committee subpoenaed 5 members of Congress, including McCarthy, that put them in a reactive position where they basically had no choice but to hit back at the panel. But for the most part, over the last year, their strategy has really been a defensive and reactive one. So that is probably what they're going to continue to focus on going forward, with the caveat, of course, that the hearings will make January 6th the top story of the month for a while. And so I think what you'll have is really just trying to rebut in real time what the committee puts out, but not obviously making that their full focus as they also try to continue to hammer on the issue that they say voters really care about, which is inflation and gas prices and immigration. We heard from the NRCC that campaigns really aren't going to at all be focused on January 6th. Candidates who aren't currently serving in Congress don't have as much of a stake in this. Their reputations are not tied up in what happened on January 6th. They weren't in Congress. For the most part, they weren't major figures in Republican politics at the center of this whole thing. And so from their perspective, from the NRCC's perspective, and from non-incumbent candidates' perspective, this just has no bearing on their messaging. And they're just going to continue to hit on issues like immigration and inflation, where they see the White House as vulnerable, and not even give January 6th really any attention.
Andrew Solender, congressional reporter with Axios. Find his story at Axios.com, and on Twitter, he's at Andrew Solender. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that House Select Committee on the investigation of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, holding that primetime hearing Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Listen and watch live on the C-SPAN network, cspanradiotv.org, our free video app, and you can also listen on your smart speaker. Say, play C-SPAN Radio. Also, the House Oversight and Reform Committee Democrats sending a letter to the National Archives that saying they have launched an investigation into gifts that former President Donald Trump received while in office. They claim that he failed to account for thousands of dollars worth of gifts from foreign officials as required by law. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Weekends on C-SPAN 2 are an intellectual feast. Every Saturday, you'll find events and people that explore our nation's past on American History TV. On Sundays, Book TV brings you the latest in nonfiction books and authors. It's television for serious readers. Learn, discover, explore. Weekends on C-SPAN 2.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, writes the Wall Street Journal, said in Senate testimony that she expects inflation to remain elevated, underscoring the challenge facing the U.S. economy and the Biden administration as inflation runs at its highest rate in decades. Mrs. Yellen testifying before the Senate Finance Committee on Tuesday, before heading to the House Ways and Means Committee on Wednesday to discuss the administration's annual budget request. With inflation running at 8% on an annual basis, the highest rate in 4 decades, she faced repeated questions about rising prices, which the Biden administration has said is its top economic priority. That from the Wall Street Journal. Here's part of the Secretary's opening statement before the Senate Finance Committee.
We currently face macroeconomic challenges, including unacceptable levels of inflation, as well as the headwinds associated with the disruptions caused by the pandemic's effect on supply chains and the effects of supply-side disturbances to oil and food markets resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine. To dampen inflationary pressures without undermining the strength of the labor market, an appropriate budgetary stance is needed to complement monetary policy actions by the Federal Reserve. Moving forward, elements of the President's proposed legislation, including the clean energy initiatives and plans to reform the prescription drug market, can help lower the costs paid by American consumers.
The Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen before the Senate Finance Committee. Many of the senators' questions also on the subject of inflation and the role of government spending. Here is the committee ranking Republican Mike Crapo of Idaho.
You've heard from both Senator Wyden and me today about the significant pain Americans are suffering because of inflation that has accelerated and become broad-based following the enactment of the American Rescue Plan last year. Democrats are claiming that Republicans are trying to raise taxes. Nothing could be further from the truth, when the reality is that as we speak, the Democrats are trying to negotiate a new massive plan that would raise taxes significantly. Do you believe that it would be prudent fiscal policy to increase taxes or engage in more stimulus spending with an economy facing the prospects of stagflation?
Senator Crapo, thank you for that question. As I indicated in my response to Senator Wyden, I believe there's a lot that Congress can do to ease the cost burdens that households are experiencing. With respect to energy, the administration has done everything that they can to bring down energy costs, for example, through an historic release of 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and energy prices, gas prices, while very high, have risen a lot. They would be higher without that. But Putin's war in Ukraine is having impacts on energy and food prices globally. We're not the only country that's experiencing inflation. You can see that in virtually every developed country around the world. What Congress can do and what the Biden administration would like to see is investments in programs like lowering prescription drug costs, investing in clean energy and renewables that would free our dependence on global oil markets, which are subject to geopolitical risk and could bring down utility bills, affordable housing, help for childcare expenses that would enable higher labor force participation, medical costs. And these are ways that the Congress and the administration can address, bring down some of the costs that households face. And it's appropriate to pay for it, or more than pay for it, to have deficit reduction. We're supportive of deficit reduction and think that asking high-income taxpayers and corporations to pay their fair share is the right way to finance those investments.
No,
and
what I
fair.
heard you say is that it is okay to raise taxes right now, and that it is proper to have more stimulus spending to deal with this crisis. I just have to say I disagree with you on that.
Senator Mike Crapo, Republican from Idaho, ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee, questioning the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at today's hearing. It was mostly on the Treasury Department's fiscal year 2023 budget request, but also veering off into other elements of the economy. Senator Crapo referring to the $1.9 trillion spending bill from 2021, the deal with COVID-19 related economic issues called the American Rescue Plan. Bloomberg Tax reporting on today's hearing, writing that Treasury Secretary Yellen aimed to position the Biden administration's stalled plan to boost IRS enforcement funding as an efficient and fair way to raise revenue and cut the budget deficit. The administration wants Congress to give the IRS an additional $80 billion over a decade, largely to bolster the ability to go after hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes that aren't collected each year. Secretary Yellen speaking about the IRS agency funding in the context of making it easier for average taxpaying Americans to file tax returns. The question's coming from Senator Tom Carper, Democrat from Delaware.
The problem we have here is that the IRS is just horrendously under-resourced. I think it's miraculous that
Would you say that again? Say that one. That bears repeating. Just say it again.
The IRS is horrendously under-resourced. It has fewer staff than it had, I believe, 40 years ago. And our economy has grown in size. It's operating with technology from the 1960s, using a programming language that is archaic and is no longer taught in any school in the country. And it doesn't have the resources it needs. And the pandemic was a huge hit to it, left it with a huge backlog of returns and information that had to be processed that is really top priority. We then asked it to get out 3 different economic impact payments, child tax payments on a monthly basis, and it's amazing that they were able to do it. So I think this is important. We're looking at it. I agree this is something that the IRS needs to do. But if we want to ask it to do these things, given all the other burdens, we really have to, and I think it should be very high priority for Congress to give the IRS the resources it needs, not to mention closing the tax gap.
I'm Tom Carper, and I approve this message. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Senator Tom Carper, Democrat from Delaware. Find today's full Senate's Finance Committee hearing at our video library at cspan.org. Wall Street today, the Dow up 264, NASDAQ up 113, S&P up 39. World Bank now projecting the world economy will expand 2.9% this year. That is down from the forecast back in January of 4.1% for 2022. That was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And speaking of that war, the U.S. has now taken control of a $325 million super yacht in Fiji owned by a Russian oligarch after getting a court there to throw out a challenge to the seizure. Also, some news on COVID here in the U.S. An outside advisory panel voting overwhelmingly to recommend the Food and Drug Administration authorize a new COVID-19 vaccine by Novavax for use in adults. Could lead to adding a fourth vaccine to the U.S. arsenal if it then gets full FDA and CDC approval. From the Guardian newspaper in Great Britain, rebel Conservative MPs drawing up plans for vote strikes to paralyze lawmaking and capitalize on the dramatic Boris Johnson no-confidence vote. Some of the 148 MPs who voted to oust the Prime Minister on Monday said they would try to stymie his government's legislative agenda, as happened at the end of the Theresa May era, by abstaining on key laws. Johnson suffered a worse-than-expected rebellion on Monday, with 40% of MPs voting to remove him. Under current rules, he's protected from another no-confidence vote for a year, reporting from The Guardian. Prime Minister Johnson started his day with a cabinet meeting and thanking those who voted to give him confidence.
Good morning, Cabinet. Thank you all very much. Very good to see you all. And I think, thank you, by the way, for everybody for all your good work yesterday, because which was a very important day, because we're able now to draw a line under the issues that our opponents want to talk about, and we're able to get on with talking about what I think the people of this country want us to talk about, which is what we are doing to help them and to take the country forward. And that is what we're going to do. We're going to focus exclusively on that, and we are helping people, of course, number one, with dealing with the aftershocks of COVID, huge sums that we're putting in to help cushion the inflationary impact, the rise in energy prices. I think a total of £37 billion we've already put in, £1,200 for 8 million of the most vulnerable households in the country. Why are we able to do this? Because we took the right decisions during COVID. We came out of that of the pandemic in a very strong economic position.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson started a cabinet meeting today in London. One of the Conservative members of Parliament who opposed the Prime Minister, voting no confidence on Monday, Tobias Ellwood, interviewed today by Sky News.
I think if there was normal times, we would see a resignation, we would see cabinet members encouraging that and the party to move on. But that's not the world that we face. This is far from a conclusive result. It's not a defeat, but it's not a win. So for the moment, I accept the democratic outcome, and I encourage all colleagues to do the same. But as you've been saying, 41% is a significant chunk of MPs that now need to be included in shaping the party's future. The conduct, I would say, over the last couple of days shows that there's a lot of work to be done to unite the party. You know, number 10, Jacob Rees-Mogg, trying to spin this all as a Remain plot, based bizarrely on an article that I actually wrote of trying to improve the Brexit model by daring to suggest that we join the single market. You know, backbenchers need to be able to express views and deep dives down on those issues. But this was almost like a Trumpian attempt to mislead and deliberately to distract us. It shows a worrying grasp of the concerns of about 150 colleagues about the direction and vision of the party.
British Member of Parliament Tobias Ellwood, a Conservative, interviewed on Sky News today, same party as the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister will face questions about that no-confidence vote, his survival. from opposition leader Keir Starmer of the Labour Party and other members of Parliament on Wednesday during Prime Minister's Question Time in the House of Commons. You can watch it live Wednesday, 7 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2 television or anywhere on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more of Washington's top stories sent to you every day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word. Sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.